Hello there. It's good to be talking to you again, and I hope, along with everybody else, that this is one of the last occasions that we have to do this remotely, and that normal service will be restored as far as events are concerned. My name is David Smith, economics editor of the Sunday Times, and I also hope that the time will come before too long when something other than the impact of the coronavirus will be occupying my attention. I've written plenty of pieces about that, and yeah, hopefully we can move on to other things quite soon. This is a good time to be talking about the outlook, both for the economy and for housing. We've just had the roadmap out of lockdown from the Prime Minister, and you will know that well. But also, we've got the budget coming up from Rishi Sunak, his second budget. His first was in March 2020, just as the crisis was breaking. He was supposed to have another one in November, but that was postponed. And of course, we had a second lockdown in November. So we'll have to see what happens, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The aim of my talk today is to talk about four things. Firstly, I'll talk about the economy and the economic outlook. Then I'll talk about the housing market and what's been happening and what is likely to happen in the housing market. Then I'll come on and one or two things to do with the budget, which is my third topic, may feature in when I'm talking about housing. But I'll talk thirdly about the budget, and then finally I'll talk about interest rates and what we might see from the Bank of England in terms of interest rates. Are we going to see more inflation? Will we see interest rates going up as a result of that kind of thing? So let me start by talking about the economy. What we've seen, of course, if you think back to March and April last year, the time of the first lockdown. Lockdown was announced on took effect from March the 23rd, 2020. But even before that, people had begun to take action. People had begun to cancel things, and so on, as I remember well, including one of these events, the landlord investment shows. And so we knew what was coming, and I think it's important to think about the way out of lockdown in that respect. I mean, if you everybody is would like the government to be able to move more quickly, but on the other hand, you can only take the public at a certain pace. People will only resort to normal behaviour when they think it is safe to do so. So you can't rush these things. People have got used to the idea of restricted movement and of social distancing and so on. But if we look at the lockdowns, we're on the third, of course. At the moment, we'll begin to see that eased on March the 8th in England when the schools go back. In some of the other nations, the schools have already gone back. But what we've seen over the period of these lockdowns is that we've become better at adapting to them. So you think back to March and April last year, we'd never seen anything like a national lockdown before. A lot of things closed. The housing market closed, for example, which it hasn't done in subsequent lockdowns, but plenty of things closed that didn't actually need to. So you think of building sites, you think of factories, and so on. They were never required to close by the government, but many did, in order that safety procedures could be implemented. So, and one of the lessons I think we've learned is that people have adapted and businesses have adapted. So the first lockdown had a very serious impact on the economy. We saw the broadest measure of economic activity, GDP, fall by almost 20% in the second quarter as a result of that first lockdown. The second lockdown in November um, lasted for just about 4 weeks, and its impact was a lot smaller. So, you think about that big fall in the economy in the spring of last year in the second quarter. big recovery as restrictions were eased in the third quarter. The economy grew by 16%, and these are numbers that we've never seen before. Normally a big change in quarterly GDP is if it rises by 1% or falls by 1%, 16%, 19% down second quarter, 16% up third quarter, are the kind of things that just show you how unusual this situation is of an economy being switched off and switched on again. And despite the November lockdown, the economy grew a little bit, 1% in the fourth quarter. It won't manage that, I don't think, in the 3 months we're in now, because this lockdown has been longer and has in many ways been more serious than the second one. But so we will see a fall. But I think this delays rather than stops the economic recovery. And the kind of roadmap that we've seen from the government does support the idea that we'll see a pretty strong recovery in the economy, in the UK economy, from the spring onwards. And I think it also supports the idea that there is much less chance of another lockdown having to be implemented as a result of the successful vaccine program. The vaccination program has been enormously successful, something we should all be proud of, that the UK has done so well. And the effect of that, I think, is to mean that you don't have to go back again. If you think back to the previous lockdowns, then they acted as a fire break, but nothing fundamental had changed. The infection, and of course, when we had the new variant at the end of last year, which was more infectious, that meant that not only had nothing changed, in some ways it had got more serious. But this time, the vaccination program offers a sustained route out of this, and I think that is very encouraging. So, I think as the year goes on, particularly as you think about the contrast between the second quarter of 2020, when the economy shrank by 19%, and the second quarter of this year, when it should show some growth. The year-on-year numbers are going to look spectacular, and I think it will feel as though the economy is growing very strongly. It will take a bit of time before we get back to where we were before this crisis hit, before the coronavirus hit back in February last year. But I think there are reasonable grounds for optimism that we're going to see a pretty strong upturn. And some of the ingredients for that you will be familiar with. People have not been able to spend on the things they normally spend on. I mean, you look at the main components of what households spend on: transport, entertainment, eating out, holidays. A lot of those things have been either restricted or have been greatly reduced. So many people, many households have built up a lot of savings. There is going to be a release of that pent-up demand when those savings are spent. And I think that's going to make a big difference in terms of supporting some of the sectors that have been hit very hard, like hospitality, like the holiday sector, the travel sector, like entertainment and so on, but also retailing. Retailers, non-essential retailers won't reopen until April the 12th, but a lot of retailers, of course, have been doing pretty good business online during this period. There are, these things are never set in stone. We could have, nasty new variants of the virus, which would set us back. But the vaccine developers are onto that and are making sure that they're responding to that danger. I suppose the big unknown, and this feeds across to the housing market, is what's going to happen to unemployment. We've had a slightly unreal situation as far as employment and unemployment is concerned because of the furlough scheme. The furlough scheme has helped many millions of people over its life. It was originally intended to last for 3 months. It is likely to be extended until we're out of these restrictions. So by the time it is finally wound down, it will have lasted for well over a year, perhaps getting on for 18 months. So this has lasted a lot longer than the Treasury ever expected. but its effect has been disguise what may be happening beneath the surface in the job market. So the unemployment rate at the moment only just over 5%, very low. It was very low before this crisis hit. It still remains quite low. If it can be kept down to say below 7%, and if it can be kept down to around 2.5 million, at the moment it's about 1.75 million, the total of unemployment, that will be quite an achievement given given the hit that the economy has taken as a result of this virus. And I think there are grounds for optimism on that. I think there are probably between 4 and 5 million people on furlough at the moment, but most of them would have, I think if employers were going to lay them off and make them redundant, they wouldn't bother with furlough. They would. This is not just a kind of staging post on the way to redundancy for most people on furlough. So I think there will be an increase in unemployment when the furlough scheme ends, but I don't think it will be quite as bad as people might have feared. And if you can restrict it to the kind of levels I talk about, that will be the lowest peak in terms of unemployment that we've had in response to the last few recessions. So it will be a pretty good outcome. No increase in unemployment is welcome, but if it can be kept quite low. And I think that's also important, and I'll talk now about the housing market. That's also important for the housing market. Housing market had an extraordinary 2020 in the circumstances. What we saw in the housing market was, mortgage approvals rising to their highest level since 2007, since before the financial crisis hit, and picking up very strongly as we went through the year. And I think it's important to think about, what lies behind a mortgage approval. Both sides of that have to have a reasonable idea and a realistic idea about what their prospects are. If people are staring redundancy in the face, they don't apply for a mortgage. And the lenders, who are under pretty strict controls these days, pretty strict regulations, don't lend to people who they fear are about to be made redundant. So I think there is an underlying strength there. This was not, I don't think, these mortgage approvals were not risky lending. They were, they were thought out. They went through the criteria and so on. So the rise in mortgage approvals is very positive. So has been the rise, after the lockdown in March and April in housing transactions, which again have picked up very strongly, and that has been, a big positive. What we've seen, and you see this from the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors and other sources, is that, people have become really quite enthusiastic about house purchase. Now, some of that is driven by the fact that they expect a change in working patterns, to last. They expect more working from home, so they want gardens, or they want to live further out from towns and cities. But some of it is born out of a kind of and people have obviously had more time to study the market. You look at traffic on Rightmove and so on has been really very strong during the pandemic and during the periods of lockdown. So I think this demand for housing is quite genuine. It has been reflected in a very strong increase in house prices. By late last year, early this year, we were seeing the strongest increases in house prices for several years, certainly going back before 2016 and the EU referendum. So the demand was there. There was a bit more supply as well. I mean, the way I characterised the housing market in the recent past was it was a combination of reluctant buyers and reluctant sellers. Sellers are sometimes reluctant to sell because they don't know well. Even the traditional route to sales, which is downsizing by older people, hadn't really been happening in the last few years. But we've seen a bit more of that, and we've seen a bit more activity. And one of the reasons for it, of course, could be that transaction costs have come down because of the stamp duty reduction announced by Rishi Sunak in July last year. And I don't think, for a second that the only reason for the housing market revival has been the stamp duty reduction. But as we've moved into this year, you've seen that people are starting to say, well, there's not time to get that transaction through before March the 31st, when the stamp duty reduction is supposed to be reversed. So I better hold off. It's if a stamp duty reduction, and it's temporary, does anything, it is to bring sales forward into the period when the reduction applies, leaving them somewhat weaker later. And of course, one of the great debates as we move into the budget, March the 3rd budget, is whether we'll get any extension of the stamp duty reduction. Um, and to me, and I've had mixed. I can't give you a definitive answer on that. I've had mixed signals from the Treasury. There was a time when they were denying any such thing, that this would that there would be any extension, because they looked at the numbers. They looked at the housing market being quite strong. The thing that encouraged the Chancellor to make the stamp duty reduction, and the evidence he cited in making that reduction, was the big fall in transactions that we saw in April, May last year, since which time, as I've described, we've seen a big resurgence in transactions. So the grounds for an extension are quite thin, quite slim at the moment, and I think that is why, for many in the Treasury, there is no point in extending it. There's also probably no point unless you were thinking purely of how do you allow people to complete transactions that they'd started. There's no point in a 6-week extension in terms of getting new transactions going, because in most cases there won't be time to complete them within the period when stamp duty has been reduced. So, and the 6-week extension has been talked about. Also, the general idea that until restrictions are lifted, the support for the economy that has been put in place should remain in place. So, there's an argument there about stamp duty. I don't know which way that is going to go. I think there's a real debate going on in the Treasury between those who think extending is unnecessary and probably wouldn't make much difference, and those who think, well, you should apply the same test to stamp duty as you do to everything else. So we'll see what that is, but the debate is certainly there at the moment. What about the lettings market? Now, you'll have heard lots in this show about the lettings market. I think one of the most interesting things, I'll just give my two pennyworth on that, which is that one of the things we've seen, one of the changes we've seen in the economy and in employment over the past year, has been a really sharp reduction in the number of migrant workers working in the UK. And in many cases, particularly those from the EU, they have returned home. And that has meant that, that this is reflected now in a pretty big fall in population, centred mainly on London. Now, will they come back? Do we know whether they will return or not? The answer is we can't be sure. Some will have settled status and the ability to return. Others will not, and of course it's government policy to limit immigration. So we don't know, and that is some of that is reflected in tenant demand, which has been weak in quite a lot of big cities, but particularly London. I think London has suffered in terms of tenant demand from the effect I was describing earlier about people wanting gardens, people wanting balconies, people not necessarily wanting to be right next to their workplace if they're no longer going into that workplace. So the working from home change, which you'll be familiar with, has made a difference. So there is quite pronounced weakness in the lettings market in the capital, and that is no surprise to you. So, and that is quite an interesting effect. This question of whether the people who've left, particularly those from the EU, have left only temporarily and will be back as soon as restrictions are lifted, or whether that is a permanent change that you have to adjust to. So we will see about that. Now, I've mentioned the budget in the context of stamp duty. What else can we expect? Now, way back in August, when the expectation in the Treasury was that the virus was on the way out, that we wouldn't see another lockdown, and there would be a budget in November. There were three areas in which the Chancellor was looking to increase tax to pay for the pandemic. The first one was corporation tax, and the idea back then was raising corporation tax from 19 to 24%. The latest iteration of that is raising it from 19 to 23%, and possibly announcing something on March the 3rd in the budget, but not implementing it until later. There's talk about not implementing it until the autumn, which I think would effectively mean it doesn't come, no increase comes into effect until the following tax year, which is 2022-23. But but that is being talked about, so that is still alive. Capital gains tax. Now, I know a lot of you are concerned about that, and that was the second one on the list. And the Chancellor had commissioned the Office of Tax Simplification to look at the issue of capital gains tax, and its report essentially recommended aligning capital gains tax with income tax, and that would be quite a considerable blow to a lot of investors, a lot of landlords, and so on. And is that still alive? I think it's still a twinkle in the Chancellor's eye. I think it is something that he would want to look at, but there's already been, and you may have seen this, a considerable backlash from entrepreneurs, particularly conservative supporting entrepreneurs. Some of that backlash we've carried in the Sunday Times, and with the argument being that this would be a real kick in the teeth for Britain's businesses, particularly small and medium-sized businesses, would be a real kick in the teeth for entrepreneurs, and it would be a very anti-entrepreneurial thing to do to increase corporation tax at this time, just when businesses are struggling to get back on their feet after the pandemic. Now, anything is possible. As I say, I think it is still a twinkle in the Chancellor's eye, but I would be somewhat surprised. I mean, I think I'd go further than that. I'd be quite surprised if we see any action on that in the budget. I mean, Rishi Sunak does not want to unnecessarily upset, conservative supporting businesses. He doesn't want to unnecessarily upset the entrepreneurial classes. I don't think he wants to upset landlords either. So I'd be very surprised to see anything on that. But we'll see. It's up in the air. He most of what he's done since he became Chancellor. He's only became Chancellor in February last year, has been handing out lots of money in support of the economy, and I think he's still going to be in that vein. So and this leads to some sort of slightly odd thinking. If there's going to be more temporary support for the economy over the next few months until restrictions are lifted, do you pay for that temporary support by by increasing taxes permanently? And that seems to be the argument about corporation tax. But as I say, capital gains tax, we'll see. There's already been a backlash. The final element of this, the final thing that was talked about was the idea of, again, which the Treasury is always quite keen on, tackling pension tax relief, and particularly higher rate pension tax relief. Heard a lot less about that in recent weeks. And the main thing I should say, so again, I'll be quite surprised by it. The main thing I've heard about capital gains tax, just to re-emphasize this point, and we'll see what happens. These things can be unpredictable. The main thing I've seen has been from outside the Treasury, such as the backlash I described, such as accountants telling me that the business owners have been bringing forward sales of businesses to escape any potential increase in capital gains tax. But I haven't heard much from within the Treasury about whether that is a runner, which again may or may not be encouraging. But as I say, I would be surprised to see it. Final thing I wanted to talk about, and thank you for listening to this point, is the Bank of England and interest rates. What's going to happen there? There's a great, as you know, the Bank of England, um, on the cusp of the handover from Mark Carney to Andrew Bailey as governor in March last year, cut bank rates to just 0.1%. It's never been as low as that. The Bank of England, as I often say, has been in existence since 1694, and for the first 300 odd years of its existence, bank rate had never been below 2%. It was cut below 2% in the early part of 2009, from where it has remained, and 0.1% is extremely low. And the great debate, and it's a pretty vigorous debate at the bank, is whether if they need to stimulate the economy more, they need to provide more help. Do they do more quantitative easing, QE, of which they've done an enormous amount this year, 450 billion or so since over the past 12 months, I should say, or do they even contemplate negative interest rates? And the way the Bank of England operates is that it has a monetary policy committee which decides on interest rates, and 5 of the members are insiders, the governor, his deputies, and so on. 4 of the members are outsiders, independent economists. The outsiders seem quite keen on negative interest rates, the insiders much less so. And when we talk about negative interest rates, we tend to think, this is not the case that we'll ever get kind of negative interest rates as they would affect you and me. The banks aren't going to pay us to borrow, and we're not going to have to pay them to put money on deposit. It's a technical move. What is the level of interest rates going to be on commercial bank reserves at the Bank of England? At the moment, those commercial banks get 0.1% on their reserves. Does it go to minus 0.1%, minus 0.3%, as much as minus 0.75%, as one of the members of the MPC has suggested? Now, there are circumstances in which the economy, has an unexpected setback, and the bank feels that it has to, wheel out some more weapons to fight that. And those circumstances would be, either that unemployment goes up a lot more than I would expect. In other words, most of the furloughed people find their way into unemployment rather than back to work, or there is a new phase of this crisis, which we all hope doesn't occur because of new variants and so on. And does the bank then have to respond to that? But in the kind of scenario I've sketched out, one in which there is a pretty strong revival of economic activity, one in which that pent-up demand, those savings that have been built up, are spent, then I just don't think they'll need to do it. I don't think they'll need to do either more QE or negative interest rates. And I think the time will come. You've talked to the people at the Bank of England, that time won't come for quite some time. I think they're still stuck in a phase of very low interest rates, lower for longer, for quite some time to come. The time may come when they have to consider when to begin raising interest rates back towards more normal levels. We're not talking about 2%. We're probably not even talking about 1%. But do they gradually have to start lifting them to more normal levels? Now, market interest rates and market mortgage rates have already gone up in some maturities, as you will know. And any decision to raise interest rates is some way off. But I think it is more likely than not that the next move in interest rates is up rather than down, but not for some time. But I don't think anybody need be worried about that, because I'm sure I'll be talking to you again before anything like that is contemplated. Thank you very much for listening, if you have done, and it's been a great pleasure to talk to you again. And as I said at the start, I hope we can do this face to face next time. Goodbye.